Do you have questions about your employment rights? Ask a Lawyer is here for you. Each week, experts from EmploymentLawyer.ca answer your questions. Visit cp24.com/askalawyer and watch Wednesdays at 9:30 p.m. on CP24.
Well, hello there and welcome again to Ask a Lawyer here on CP24. Good to have you along for this 30-minute ride. You will learn a lot. That much I can almost guarantee you. John Scholes here joining me this week. John Pincus from EmploymentLawyer.ca. John will be on your screen momentarily, and you're always asked, in fact, encouraged to reach out to John when we're not doing this TV show. How do you do that? 1-855-821-5900. Ask at EmploymentLawyer.ca, and also the website pocketemploymentlawyer.ca, which will dig a little deeper into in just a few minutes here with John as well. Wrongful dismissal. What is it? That's the main topic in just a little bit. And we'll get to some phone calls from our long-running radio shows, and including here in the GTA, which you can join us Sundays, 1 p.m. Call into the show. Maybe you'll make it on this TV show as well. And that would be News Talk 1010, again, Sundays at 1 p.m. Okay, that said, we're set to go with the main topic in just a bit. But we always start off with a case of the day or a week that was. Mr. Pincus, what do you got going on, pal? How are you?
Well, it's good to be back. I'm good, and I'm happy to be talking about employment law today because employment law is dynamic. It's always changing. The workplace is always changing. It's always evolving. So when the law changes, people need to know what their rights are, employees and employers alike. And if you make a mistake when it comes to your workplace rights, whether you're an employee or an employer, those mistakes can be disastrous. Perfect example of both these things. Very recently, someone came to me who had been working in a niche industry, in the tech industry, but a very niche subset of the tech industry his whole life. And he, about 2 years ago, got a new job with a small startup tech company. And very recently they said, you know what, you're a sales manager, but sales have been down and we're not really happy with you, so we're going to let you go. And we have this contract that you signed when you started with us 2 years ago, so we are going to give you 2 weeks' pay, and if you sign this nice release we prepared for you, we'll give you another 2 weeks' pay. That's what he told me when he came to me, and he said, John, I am so stressed out because not only have they told me that they're only going to give me 4 weeks to find a new job, they're pointing to their employment contract where they say they can stop me from working for a year for any of the competition. And that's a big deal for me because this is the industry I've worked in my whole life. All of a sudden I take a job for 2 years and it's like I'm shut out of the entire industry I've ever worked in. Well, fortunately for him, I had some good news. First of all, non-competes have been outlawed in Ontario, which is where he was, since October of 2021. So that non-compete was totally illegal. The other good news is that the termination clause of the company was relying on was also totally illegal. So he was free to compete, and he was entitled to as much as 4 times what he was offered, a little more than 4 times, about 4 months' pay. That's going to be a significant amount of money that he's owed, and we're going to help him negotiate that. So you can see the law is always changing. Non-competes, they've always been difficult to enforce. Now they are impossible if you've signed one after October 2021. Perfect example of how the law is always changing. And perfect example of how signing something without knowing what it is can be disastrous if you don't understand it. So the first lesson here is get advice at the time you are given those offers, right? Don't just sign it and say, I'm sure it's fine, I'll deal with it later. You might not be able to. And the other thing is, even more importantly, when you are given a severance package from an employer, that's at a critical time. That's a really important time. That's when you need to get advice. That's when you need to speak to an employment lawyer.
It's interesting, John. I think it also speaks to the fact that whether you're an employee going into a job or an employer with an employment contract, it may not hold any water. If you're an employer, you don't want to get I'm going to search on Google, employment contract, here, I'll print this off, sign it. That's going to be absolutely useless. And if you're an employee, just because you have a contract, it may, as you say, be out of date and not enforceable, yeah?
Right. It always happens when you don't involve a lawyer at the first stage, right? If you want to end right, you got to start right. And if you don't start right by getting that advice when you're creating that contract as an employer or signing that contract as an employee, you're going to have a problem later.
As I mentioned off the top, guys, News Talk 1010, that is our station here in the GTA. You can catch our radio show Sundays at 1 p.m. We got lots of great phone calls every week. We pull some from that show. We play them back here because it's always informative and educational. I know John wants to talk about our first phone call momentarily, which is coming up right now, so listen up.
My brother-in-law is a mechanic, has been employed with his last employer for about 10 or 12 years. For a number of years, he's been doing the odd oil change in his own garage on behalf of family, friends, and a few others. His employer has been fully aware of this and fired him and said to him he would be receiving absolutely no severance whatsoever. Where do you think he will be going as far as termination?
How old is he?
55.
No garage oil changes, John. I think
Right.
I'm on.
Right. Well, this does raise an important topic that everyone should be aware of, is that if you are an employee, you have what's called a duty of fidelity to your employer, right? You cannot be competing for your employer at the same time that you're working for your employer. And you want to be very careful about this, because some things that you may not be considered competition, you say, well, my employer's not really offering this service. Well, maybe they're planning on offering that service. Maybe they'd like to know about this. So the key thing is you need to make your employer know, ideally in writing. Because if you don't put it in writing, you might have a dispute later, which looks like what's going on here. Now, if it is the case that the employer knew about this, it's not up to the employer, it's not open to the employer, rather, to turn around at the time of termination and say, well, I don't like this anymore, so I'm terminating your employment for cause. No, if the employer knew about it, doesn't matter if they can later argue that it might be competition. If the employer knew about it and didn't do anything about it, it's going to be very likely a wrongful dismissal. And let's take a look at the Pocket Employment Lawyer and see how much this person could be owed if it is in fact a wrongful dismissal. And we see that the amount is significant, right? 55 years old for 12 years in a mechanic position. This is about $73,000 a year that this person's earning. So we're looking at 16 months pay, 16 months pay. So you can imagine the stakes are huge. And that's why it's so important to get these things in writing. But if the employer can't establish that they were unaware of this, then it's going to be a wrongful dismissal. That's a significant amount.
And as John just mentioned, PocketEmploymentLawyer.ca is where you want to go. Okay, wrongful dismissal. What is it? We'll break it down after we come back from a short break, which we're going to get into right now. Ask a Lawyer on CP24.
You have questions about your employment rights? Ask a Lawyer is here for you. Each week, experts from EmploymentLawyer.ca answer your questions. Visit cp24.com/askalawyer and watch Wednesdays at 9:30 p.m. on CP24.
And welcome back to Ask a Lawyer. This is CP24. John Scholes here, and the lawyer this week, John Pincus from EmploymentLawyer.ca. Always reach out to John when you're not watching the show. The phone number first, 1-855-821-5900, or if you prefer to back that up with an email, that's simply ask@EmploymentLawyer.ca. Okay, main topic for this week is a term that people don't understand because it sounds a little convoluted. What is it? We'll break it down. Wrongful dismissal is what it's called. You've heard us talk about it on the show for years and on the radio show as well. Definition of wrongful dismissal, John, I guess that's where we start, pal. What is it?
It's one of the most misunderstood terms that you can find in the law, because I can't tell you how often I have people come to me, very understandably they think this because the term kind of implies this when you hear it, and they say, you know, my employer fired me and I was doing so well. I had a good performance review. I've never had any issues. They fired me. I think it's a wrongful dismissal. Well, that's not what a wrongful dismissal is. Now, your employer can't fire you for any reason. They can't fire you at any time. There are certain times where your employer firing you could be discriminatory, it could be a statutory breach, but your employer has broad discretion in terminating your employment, and they don't necessarily have to justify it. So if there's a restructuring, if they're just unhappy, if they're just not getting along with you, the question isn't, do they have a right to let you go? Most of the time, the question that we're talking about is, what is the proper amount of severance that you're owed? And that can be very significant. That's a very important question, because depending on your age, depending on your length of service, depending on the kind of position you held, how hard it's going to be replaced at, are you suffering from any medical conditions that your employer may have known about, that could be very, very significant. It could be as much as 2 years' pay in some circumstances. So the question is very important, but the answer isn't always what people expect it to be.
Right. So based on what you said there, how common is it, wrongful dismissal?
I would say about 90%
Wow.
of people who come to me with a severance package have an inadequate severance package. And that's not a coincidence. Now, in some cases, the employer says, well, I think this is all that I owe. And sometimes unintentionally, they're offering an inadequate severance package. But very often, it is intentional. It's intentional because that employer, naturally, wants to save money.
Yep.
Of course they want to save money. That's what they're in the business of, making money and cutting costs. And one of the biggest costs are labor costs. So they're going to try and cut down that severance as much as they can. And it's going to be up to you to decide whether you're going to speak to an employment lawyer and intervene with an employment lawyer if necessary.
So based on your breakdown of what it is and how it happens, if I think I've been wrongfully dismissed in my job, what do I do?
Well, the first and the most important thing to do is go to an employment lawyer, because an employment lawyer is going to do two very important things for you. First of all, they're going to give you advice. They're going to tell you whether the severance package that you've been offered is something that you should accept. And the second thing that they're going to do is, if that severance package is inadequate, they're going to intervene on your behalf. And it's very important, if you're going to negotiate a severance package, to have the credibility of a lawyer intervening for you, someone who's going to be able to take the actions necessary to enforce your entitlement if the employer doesn't agree.
One of the first things that somebody comes to you, John, with the their severance package, they say, oh, but it's got a deadline. It's got a deadline. Is that enforceable? It makes me nervous having that on there.
Well, what I always tell clients is that deadline only matters if you're going to accept the severance package. The moment that we have a discussion and we determine that it's an inadequate severance package and not one you should be accepting, that deadline goes out the window. It's meaningless. We're going to give them a proposal and we're going to give a deadline, right? So that deadline really, the moment you decide to negotiate your entitlements, is totally meaningless. And the deadline that matters at that point is the 2-year deadline, 2 years from the date you get your notice of termination. Because if you miss that deadline, well, then that's really game over.
I want to get to another phone call. John wants to answer this one. Again, reminder, anytime, News Talk 1010, Sundays, 1 p.m. That's when you reach out to us. Join us on that hour-long radio program. Call in, and maybe your phone call will appear on air. We'll get to it right now. Listen up.
My wife's been working for, we'll say, a large bank for over 10 years. Over the last couple of years, she's had some health issues, and just kind of resulted in her not being at work as much as possible. And they say, well, your output of work has lowered over the last 2-3 years out of your, tenure. And she's saying, well, obviously it has. I'm not there as much. She's doing as much or more as anybody else in the office if you were to look at the actual numbers. It feels as if they're kind of trying to force her out.
What do you think, Johnny?
Well, the thing that everyone should know when it comes to a medical leave, for any reason, doesn't matter what the reason is that you are protected against discrimination for medical issues. And so in this case, it would be governed by the Canadian Human Rights Act. And the Canadian Human Rights Act protects people under what's known as disability. Disability is the term that most of the laws in Canada use. And disability is defined very, very broadly. So for example, in the Canadian Human Rights Act, it's anything physical, it's anything mental, it's alcohol dependency or drug dependency. So if you have any of these issues, and that is the reason you are not able to be at work, or you're not able to be at work full time, and your employer is giving you a disadvantage as a result of that, that could be a violation of a human rights statute, and that could be a very serious issue for the employer. So the first thing that you want to do in this circumstance is, it sounds like she's been being mistreated at work. And so normally what I would say is have an employment lawyer write a letter to get this employer to back off so you can focus on your health and not have to worry about this. And if it's a large bank, they'll know once they get a letter, they'll involve the powers that be, and they'll be set straight, likely at that point. If after that happens, or before that happens, the bank lets this person go, this is someone who should be contacting a lawyer, because it's not only going to be likely a wrongful dismissal, as we discussed, because most severance packages are inadequate, but potentially a human rights violation as well.
Phone call number 3, that's how we roll on the show, but that's going to come up after the break, so stick around for that as we continue more Ask a Lawyer right here on CP24.
You have questions about your employment rights? Ask a Lawyer is here for you. Each week, experts from EmploymentLawyer.ca answer your questions. Visit cp24.com/askalawyer and watch Wednesdays at 9:30 p.m. on CP24.
All right, welcome back to Ask a Lawyer. This is CP24. John Scholes here, and John Pincus from EmploymentLawyer.ca is with us this week. You can always reach out to John when we're not doing the show. 1-855-821-5900. Ask at EmploymentLawyer.ca, or scan that QR code on the right side of your screen for more details and information as well. Okay, phone call number 3. We do them in threes here on this show. And one more reminder before the end of the show, News Talk 1010, Sundays, 1 p.m. Join us for Ask a Lawyer, Employment Hour on the radio, and call in. Maybe you'll make it on air here during this half hour. Let's get to phone call number 3.
I'm being transferred, I guess, like changing companies, not really voluntarily. My responsibilities are getting a little bit more, but my pay isn't going to be affected. I'm all of a sudden being forced to sign documents to say that I'm now working for a new company with a new employee handbook that talks about dismissal without severance. I am being asked to sign documents that I will never try to advance myself or get a promotion.
How long have you worked with the existing company?
Around 9 years.
All right. What do you think?
Yeah, so that's a very interesting situation. So I'm going to assume for our purposes today that we're talking about an asset purchase. Usually that's what we're talking about when a new company's changing hands and the new company is asking you to sign an employment agreement. So what people need to know is when a new company takes over, the company that you were just working for, the company that has sold the business, they've just fired you. They've just fired you because, as this person said, it wasn't voluntary. This person didn't agree to work for someone new. So they fired you. And the default is if you don't go to work for the new employer, they're going to owe you some severance. The question is going to be, how much severance do they owe? And to answer that question, we need to look at whether the new job is comparable, right? So this is not a constructive dismissal because you've already been fired. The question is, do you have an obligation to take the new job? If you do, then your old employer may only owe you the minimum entitlement if you say no to the new job. If you don't take the new job and it's not comparable, then you can actually be entitled to your full severance. And here that looks like it may be the case because this person is looking like to get some change responsibilities and some new conditions that'll basically eviscerate their ability for career advancement. When we're looking at that, we do have to compare it to what was the situation in the old job, because if they were the same conditions or very similar, that could be a problem. But let's assume that it really isn't comparable. Let's pull up the Pocket Employment Lawyer and see what this person might be entitled to. And we look after 9 years earning $90,000 a year at the age of 58, we're talking about a six-figure entitlement, right? Over $100,000. So we really, really want to look at this situation very carefully. And very important for this person to know that before they say yes or no to that job offer, really have to sit down with an employment lawyer, look at it, and make sure you make an informed decision.
I want to reach into the email bag and get one on air here with the remaining time. Before we got to take a break, here it is for this week. John says, I had to take a long-term disability due to severe stress over a year ago. Since then, my adjuster has harassed me and recently cut off my claim, claiming insufficient medical evidence. I'm not ready to go back to work and can't even get a hold of my employer about my job. Can you help?
Well, I'm going to say something that I've never said before on this show, John, and that is going to say the first person you call is not the employment lawyer. It's not the employment lawyer, it's the disability lawyer, right? The disability lawyer, because you want to make sure that you deal with this long-term disability denial, because that is going to be something that could actually eclipse your severance entitlement. And why do I say that? Because when we're talking about a severance entitlement, we may be talking about 6 months, 12 months, 24 months, right? When we're talking about a disability entitlement, we could be talking about compensation up until age 65, right? So if you're in your 40s or 50s, you can just do the math, right? It's going to be significantly more. But you're also going to want to speak to an employment lawyer, and you want those two to coordinate, or you want someone who can do both at the same time, because you need to make sure that you also hold your employer to account, and you need to make sure that you hold these people to account in the right order, right? Typically, you want to deal with the disability issue first. So speak to an employment lawyer, speak to a disability lawyer, but make sure you deal with both of those together.
And you're wondering, how do I do that? No problem. They're all within the same firm. John has colleagues that do the disability side of the firm as well. Lots more to go. We'll get to more of your email questions after a break right here on Ask a Lawyer. Stick around.
You have questions about your employment rights? Ask a Lawyer is here for you. Each week, experts from EmploymentLawyer.ca answer your questions. Visit cp24.com/askalawyer and watch Wednesdays at 9:30 p.m. on CP24.
Welcome back. Ask a Lawyer here on CP24. If you want to join John Pincus, who's with us this week from EmploymentLawyer.ca, you can always do so on the phone, 1-855-821-5900. That's how you get a hold of him, or email ask@employmentlawyer.ca. Okay, in addition to that, John, I know does a lot of live streaming with the firm. They answer your questions on the live stream, Facebook, YouTube, LinkedIn. How to join that at stlawyers.ca. We'll get your foot in the door, and maybe your question will appear on a future show. Here it is for this week, John. I know you want to answer this. It says, how long can my employer keep me working reduced hours for? Can I refuse after a certain amount of time has passed and my hours have not been restored?
Really, really tricky issue, right? Okay. Whenever you have your job change, whenever your hours change, you want to make sure that you get advice and get advice quickly. Because if you wait too long, you may be deemed to accept it. Pull the trigger too early, might be acting prematurely, might be deemed resignation. Right. So very stressful situation, understandably, and that's why employment lawyers are here to walk you through these things. Because we can help guide you, okay, here's the way that you should communicate this is when you should communicate it, and this is how you should communicate it. If hours of work are tied to this person's pay, right, they're paid on an hourly basis and they're going to be earning less money as a result, and depending on the level of reduction that's going to be, that could be a constructive dismissal, and you want to make sure to act quickly. It may also make more sense to object and stay in the job. You want to run through these scenarios with an employment lawyer so we can help obtain your objectives and how to achieve them.
The employer have a little bit of leeway as far as, in this case, pay, what, 10%, 5%, 15%? How far can they go without it being constructive dismissal?
You know, there's no hard and set rule, but employers do have leeway. There are a certain degree of management rights. So, for example, if your employer's changing your pay and it's less than 5%, I'd say very unlikely that's going to be a wrongful dismissal, a constructive dismissal. On the other hand, if your employer is making a change to your pay where you're going 30% less than you were earning before, it's very unlikely that that is not going to be a constructive dismissal. So it is a question of gradation. There's no hard lines. You really have to go through it with an employment lawyer and understand the history of your job and how it's going to affect you.
You know, it's interesting. Maybe your life has changed a bit. Maybe you could do with a little less pay because you like the job, maybe you like the location. Can you take it out for a spin and say to your employer, I'm just giving this a shot for a few weeks, see how it affects my lifestyle. If it's no good, I want to go back. Can you do that?
It depends. It
Right.
typically depends the kind of change. Where I often recommend doing that is where a commission structure has changed, right? Because when a commission structure has changed, you really don't know at the outset most of the time how it's going to impact you. That's where you want to really test it out, see if it actually results in a lower compensation at the end of the day.
And get that in writing always, right?
Get that in writing.
Like everything else, get everything else in writing.
Otherwise, it doesn't exist.
Yeah, otherwise it doesn't exist. Sage advice, my friend, but we are done for another week. Thank you so much for your contributions. Again, several different ways you can reach out to John and his team as well when we're not doing this half-hour TV every week. Phone number 1-855-821-5900. Ask at EmploymentLawyer.ca. The website John referred to a couple times where you can get that severance calculator. It's a beauty. It's free. It's anonymous. That's PocketEmploymentLawyer.ca. And of course, the radio show. Join us Sundays at 1 p.m. News Talk 1010. An opportunity for the entire hour for you to call in, join us, ask your questions. They may appear on a future show right here. So there you go. All kinds of contact. Thank you so much for tuning in this week. We'll catch you next time right here. Ask a Lawyer on CP24.